We continue with Job today with the question of how do we deal when difficulties arise? When tough things happen in my life, how do I deal with that? James chapter 1 tells us that we are to consider it pure joy when we face trials of many kinds. Nobody's good at that. And in fact, what tends to happen is if we say, well, I'm going through trials, I'm going to consider it pure joy, what we're doing is we're pretending like everything's okay when it isn't. And Job confronts that false mentality. And this doesn't mean that we air out our dirty laundry all the time, or we whine and moan and groan and woe is me about everything. But Job calls us to take the time to sit in the difficult, to not avoid. And that's where we're going today. We're not going to avoid. And Job shows us how to do that. We still may not be good at it, but Job, he not just tells us how to do it, he says he calls us to do it. He gives us the invitation to join him in it. But one of the underlying questions throughout the book of Job is this concept, will Job bless God or will Job bless God? And because this word, when it's translated in chapters 1 and 2, it will say, will Job bless God or will Job curse God? But it's really the same word, bless. Just like we can use the word thanks with that. Somebody gives a gift to you, you say thank you. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, you say thanks a lot, bud. Right? The same word, thanks, is used there. So that's what's happening. Job is being tested. Will he actually bless God or will he bless God? That is what is at stake here. That's what's happening. And I do think we need to be careful because we tend to go, woe is me, over really minor issues. And when I say minor issues, sometimes they can be more major than others. But if you lock your keys in your car, that's super frustrating. But in the grand scheme of things, it's probably a really minor issue. If you burn the pan of brownies, that's really frustrating. But in the grand scheme of things, it's probably very minor. And so we have to make sure Job is not giving us an invitation to moan and groan about every little thing that we encounter, but he does invite us to experience his pain. You are invited. That's what Job does. He invites us into that. And so I want to challenge you to don't avoid the void. And maybe that's a little cheesy, but when I say the void, I'm saying the deep, the dark, the difficult, the despair. Don't avoid that. That's what Job invites us to. Now, in chapter 3, we begin a shift in the book of Job. Chapters 1 and 2 were a story, narrative type thing about Job's struggles, his trials, how he was tested, and all the difficulties he went through. But in chapters 3 through 31, we have a dialogue between Job and his three friends, Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad. And it's back and forth. Job will speak, then one of the friends will speak. Then Job will speak, one of the other friends will speak. And so in chapter 3, we see it's Job's first speech. And Job essentially, in chapter 3, he essentially questions, why is he still living? He questions the day of his birth. He says, God, why did you allow me to live? If you were going to have me suffer so intensely, why am I still even here? Now, Job is not advocating for suicide or mercy killing or anything of that nature. He's just saying, God, what's my purpose? If this is where you've put me, and this is who I am now, what's my purpose? Remember, every material possession of Job was taken away or destroyed. All of his kids were killed. His wife had forsaken him. He is now covered in boils, scraping himself with pottery, sitting in the ashes. This is not somebody that just had a run of bad luck. This is someone who is completely destroyed as an individual. And he's saying, God, why do I even exist? Why is God not ending? God, why are you not ending my life now? And in chapter 3, Job uses this Hebrew word Sheol, Sheol. And it describes, it's the same word that Jonah in the book of Jonah that is used to describe when he is swallowed by the great fish and goes down. And then this word Sheol is the Old Testament Hebrew word that would be most closely related to just things like hell or Hades that we would talk about, but it's distinctly different. It's the depths. It's the place of despair, the place of shadow, the place of no hope. That's where Job is. He's a place of complete and utter despair. Now, he does indicate in chapter 3, he did fear this was going to happen. So we do get an indication that Job had anxiety that tragedy would happen to his life. Now, sometimes our current situation can distort our perspective. See, when we're experiencing pain, there's a tendency then we forget all the joy of yesterday when we're experiencing discomfort today. And we say, why is this happening to me? I may have had 112 awesome days in a row, but this day is bad, and so now I'm really frustrated. And we can get consumed by our current situation. Now, there's nothing wrong with Job asking God or saying, why do I exist? Job never crosses a line to curse God. He does come close. He is questioning God. He's crying out to God in despair. And then we get to chapters 4 and 5. Now, I'm not going to read these because we're talking about 5 chapters. I would encourage you to read them on your own. And in part, you'll notice things that I missed or things that I don't highlight in the sermons. And that's okay, but there's a lot here. Job has 42 chapters, and I didn't want to spend 42 weeks on it. So take that for what it's worth. But it's a lot of back and forth here, so I challenge you to read it on your own. So Eliphaz is the first friend to speak, and we find him in chapters 4 and 5. He is the oldest. He is more elegant than the others. We come Eliphaz the elegant. The next one is Bildad, and he's brutal. So I've heard people call him Bildad the brutal. And then we have Zophar, who is passionate. Not a good alliteration with him, but that's okay. So it goes in age order. And so Eliphaz speaks, and he starts by he butters Job up. He starts off with some compliments, some nice things, some encouraging things, because he's trying to get to a point where he can put Job in his place. We've done that before. We give a compliment only then to give a critique. We're trying to make it so we can have a conversation with the person. But what Eliphaz does is he assumes that sin is the reason for Job's suffering. And so we have this concept between guilt and innocence. Am I guilty or am I innocent? Now, if you remember in chapters 1 and 2, God has identified Job as blameless. There's no one else on earth like him. He walks faithfully with God. This doesn't mean he's perfect, but it means that he is extremely dedicated to God and his relationship with God. He is blameless. But Eliphaz's perspective is dangerous. See, but part of Eliphaz is he's kind of presenting this as a lawyer trying to convict Job of guilt. But in this, Eliphaz accuses Job. He says, you can give it, but you can't take it. And on some levels, we're a little blindsided here because we don't really know much context. All we know is that Job is blameless. He's experienced all these tragedies, and he's crying out to God. And Eliphaz comes in here, butters him up for just a second, and then says, hey, man, you're full of baloney. You're a hypocrite. You can give it, but you can't take it. See, what's happening here is Eliphaz and Zophar and Bildad, well, it's two, they have a false premise. All three have this false premise that if you do what is right, it will go well for you. If you do what is wrong, God will bring wrath upon you. We call that the prosperity gospel. If you're faithful to Jesus, he'll give you these worldly things. If you're unfaithful to Jesus, he will take the worldly things away from you. If you're faithful to Jesus, your health will be good. If you're not faithful to Jesus, your health will be poor. That's the premise that all three friends have. Now, Eliphaz does something that it infuriates us when other people do it. He claimed to have a special revelation. So essentially, what he was telling Job, he said, God said to me, God revealed this to me, you lowly, hypocritical person. He's being condescending in this special revelation that he claims to have had. What makes it a little bit ironic is that the prevailing scholarly opinion is that this revelation that he had was either illegitimate or it was from some type of evil force. Because the insights that Eliphaz has from this special revelation do not reflect God's character. God doesn't trust his people. God doesn't love his people. It's demeaning towards God's people, and that's not the message God gives. That's not what would happen. So was this just, was he lying? Or was he deceived by something contrary to God? Eliphaz was deceived, and he thinks he received a special privilege when in all reality he didn't. Now, one of the things about Eliphaz and all of the friends in general is that they are theologically imbalanced. They have certain things about God that are correct, but they don't have the full picture of who God is. So Eliphaz, in this moment, views God as just. And we say, yes, God is just. That is correct. That is true. But God is also loving. God is merciful. He is compassionate. He forgives. And Eliphaz ignored all those. He just viewed God as just. If you do what is right, if you honor God, he will give you things. If you don't honor God, he will take things away and bring hardships upon you. He's claiming that trouble comes from our own actions. When bad things happen to me, it's because I've done bad things. He's telling Job, you must have done bad things. That is why bad things are happening to you. And those are pretty surface level conclusions. I mean, we've seen good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. And it's hard to reconcile it. But just to say, well, you got your just desserts isn't satisfying, nor is it correct from a theological standpoint. Now, Eliphaz does tell Job, he says, you need to seek God, you need to commit to God, and then God would surely care for Job. Oh, okay, yeah, just seek the presence, the comfort of God, and God will take care of you. Yes, we agree with that. The problem is Eliphaz is saying that if you seek God, he will give you the material possessions back. He will make you prosperous again. He's going to further conclusions in what God actually is. Now, Eliphaz does say, he says, Job, you may not know the sin that you committed, but Job does need to accept the suffering as part of God's discipline. Those are the claims he's making. He's trying to move past the suffering that Job was enduring to get to these easy answers to make him feel better about himself. See, the issue that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar had is that they had to have a reason for why Job was suffering. If there was no sin in Job's life that then caused the suffering, then Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they would have had anxiety that maybe that could happen to us too. But I'm doing the right things. I'm doing the things I'm supposed to do. I am not doing these things over here that God said not to do. I am doing these things over here that God said to do. So I'm doing those things. I'm doing the good. I'm avoiding the bad. So God should only put good in my life. But if there's something deeper than that happening in Job's life, then it confronts their false understanding. It confronts their false idea of what's happening. And the book of Job is written to confront those issues, to confront those misunderstandings. So that there are deeper reasons for suffering than just sin alone. Now, we can boil suffering down to sin in many ways. We live in a sinful world. People are going to do sinful things to us. Maybe you didn't sin, but they are sinning. That's still really difficult. Remember, God's all powerful. God's all loving. Why would he allow me to suffer if I'm being faithful to him? Now, Eliphaz does end with a word of assurance. He tells Job that the same God who wounds is the same God that heals. The problem is that's really the philosophy of Satan. Because what Eliphaz is telling Job to do, he's saying, strike a bargain with God. God, if you'll do this, I'll do this. That's not how God works. And praise the Lord that it's not. God didn't send Jesus to die on the cross for us once we did enough good works so that we would deserve it. While we were still sinners, God showed his great love for us by sending Jesus to die for us. God is a gracious God who gives abundantly out of his love to us. He pours out his love on us lavishly. That is who God is. That's not the God of Eliphaz. That's not who Eliphaz is proclaiming Job follows. But in chapter 6 and 7, we find Job's response. This is his second speech, the second time that he speaks in the book from a monologue, from a speech standpoint. And Job, he says, I have a right to complain. I've gone through a lot. I have a lot going on in my life. Job admits that his language is strong, but he tells his friends that if you were in my shoes, you would feel the same way. He was trying to get his friends to understand the depths of what he was going through. The problem is none of his friends empathized with him. Now, if you remember, at the end of chapter 2, Job's friends come from what seems like a long distance, and they sit with him in the ashes for 7 days without talking. No one spoke for 7 days. So their care for Job seems authentic. They come and they sit with him. And for 7 days, it seems like they're trying to be good friends to Job. But when they speak, they start being disrespectful. They start being bad friends to him. See, Job's friends didn't understand his pain. They didn't feel the heaviness that he endured. They didn't grasp the bitterness that he had. They didn't see the sorrow that consumed him. Now, from the outside, they could say, okay, Job lost all of his material possessions, and he was the wealthiest man around. He lost his kids, all 7 sons and 3 daughters, died. His wife has forsaken him. On paper, we could say, oh man, that's tragic. That's really, really hard. But his friends still didn't care. Now, one of our dilemmas here, in chapters 1 and 2, we find that God allowed Job to suffer. The examiner came, or Satan came to God, and God offered Job, said, have you considered my servant Job? God offered Job to the examiner for this testing. God allowed the pain, but Job did not know why. But even so, Job was confident that he had no unconfessed sin. Now, that's a pretty bold stance to take. We do remember God identified Job as blameless, so that does track. But he was confident. And the reality is, he was that close to God. He was that sensitive to when he had taken a step out of, he was no longer in step with God. He was confident in that. Now, we can say that trials have a purpose. Sometimes we don't understand those purposes. The examiner used these trials to torment Job. The examiner used Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar to discourage Job. And I would go as far to say the examiner even tried to use God's silence as a way to break Job. God does not speak until chapter 38. We're in chapters 3 through 7. That's a long time. There, God is silent. And Job is struggling. And the examiner is trying to break Job. And there can be different reasons and purposes for why God allows trials in our life. Sometimes God teaches us deeper truths, get us a greater understanding, or just helps us in our depth in our relationship with him. Sometimes God uses trials to confront the lies of Satan. And that's what's happening here, is that the examiner is questioning God. Well, Job was only faithful to you because he's wealthy. And God says, test him. God is confronting the lies of the enemy. Now, Job, in chapters 6 and 7, tried to get his friends to feel the depth of the hopelessness of his situation. Not just look at the logistics of how much money did he lose, how many kids did he lose, not just the numbers, but the depth of how hopeless Job was. But Job is not letting him off the hook. He is saying, sit with me in this. He's telling him, don't avoid the void, don't avoid the difficult, don't just pass by the uncomfortable, sit in it. Allow yourself to experience it and process it. Now, I've heard it said that a wise counselor or comforter listens with the heart and responds to the feelings and the words. It's one thing to be able to know the right thing. It's another thing to be able to feel the right thing. It's both of those working together. So Job calls us not just to know the right thing, not just to feel the right thing, but to do both of them. That love must accompany truth. And I'm guessing, and as we see the friends get more and more hostile in their responses, that Job's commitment to the fact that he had no unconfessed sin, that his commitment to his innocence, it undermined their theology so intensely that they could not stand it. It robbed them of their peace. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, their peace was removed when God was more than just. When God was merciful and compassionate and forgiving. When the understanding of God was more robust and complete, it undermined what they thought, because they thought, if I just do the right things, my stuff will be protected. My health will be secure. I will be okay. But Job is confronting that. But one of the things Job does is that Job is unwilling to sit there and be passive. Job is very active and confident in his approach. And what I say is Job didn't just sit there and accept, well, come what may, I trust whatever God has for me. Now, he did trust God, and we see that throughout. But he went to God and said, why? He went to God with confidence saying, I'm experiencing crazy difficulties. Why are you allowing this to happen to me? And I think one of the things at play here is that Job is so close to God that he is comfortable going to God about everything. There's nothing that is withheld. That Eliphaz is far enough away from God that if bad things happen, he just takes a step back and says, God, I don't want to anger you anymore. I'm just gonna be passive back here and not engage in the relationship. But Job engaged in the relationship. And it reminds me, I've shared before how I really enjoy coaching youth sports. And there's a difference between the kids and their comfort with me. There's some kids that, this is my first year of coaching, and so we've known each other for like 4 or 5 weeks. And so their comfort to come to me, to talk to me, is limited. There's some kids I've coached for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Their comfort to come talk to me is significantly greater than those kids that it's his first year. But none of them compare to my kids. My kids got an issue, they come to me. Because they know me. They know I'm their father. They know me. That's how much Job knew God. Like, it wasn't a matter of, he's like, I'm right. I know this is wrong. Why is God doing this? He was so comfortable with God that he went to God about everything. That's what Job is doing here. He's not going to God with arrogance and defiance and trying to undermine God's authority. He's going to him because he wants answers. He's desperate for answers. And he knows that God is loving. He knows that God is just. He knows that God receives him. And he's saying, God, why? Why do I still exist? What is my purpose? Why are you allowing this to happen in my life? Not in a way that is belittling God or demeaning God, but in a way that is crying out in desperation. That's what Job is doing. And he recognized that. He says, life is short. God, if you're going to answer, you don't got much time left. Remember, Job has no money, no family. He is sick, covered in boils. So he is like on his deathbed. His wife told him in chapter 2, you should curse God and die. That's all that was left for Job to do. And so Job said, God, I'm struggling. There's not much time left. If you're going to answer, now's the time. Job is crying out with such desperation. Now, we can talk about how our suffering and difficulties have a purpose, how God can sometimes allow us to endure difficulties to help us grow, how other times when we face difficulties, God can transform them and redeem them for his purposes. We can talk about that, and I thank God that those things are true. But what Job is doing is he's inviting us into his difficulty to teach us that we don't just move past the difficulty to get to the stuff that makes us feel better. We sit in the difficulty. But the only way we can do that is if we have such an intimate relationship with the Father that we go to him. If you don't trust God, then you're not going to be able to do this. It's going to be way more difficult. It's going to be a lot harder to do it. That's what Job is inviting us to. He's inviting us to say, don't skip over the difficult parts just to get to the easy parts. I think one of the things we do as Christians, I know I do, is that we know about the crucifixion of Jesus, and we love the resurrection of Jesus, but we forget that there was a time in between, a time of difficulty, a time of hopelessness, a time of confusion. And we like to rush to Sunday. We like to rush past those difficulties, but we need to take some time to sit in those. Not to dwell or wallow in our sorrow, not to ruminate over the annoying things in life, but to allow ourselves to process the full gamut of emotions. That's where Job is leading us. And it's leading us to a specific place where the premise of the book actually changes at the conclusion. It recognizes that the premise was false to begin with. The issue of will Job bless God or will Job bless God isn't the actual conclusion of the book. But Job ends his second speech, chapter 7, with humility. He does say, he says, if I have sinned, He makes that statement because he opens up the possibility that maybe he has, maybe he is unaware, but he still maintains his innocence because a false apology is worthless. Job's not just going to say, ask for forgiveness just to cover his basis. He maintains his integrity because he's blameless, because he has run to God's presence and saying, God, why? Answer me. And there are times he's really passionate. There's times he's almost demanding, say, God, show up now. But Job never sinned. And I think Job teaches us that sometimes I think we've taught ourselves that we have to suppress our emotions. When the difficulties happen, we have to say, you know what? This is really hard, but I'm going to act like everything's okay. Job calls us to something deeper. He calls us, don't avoid the void. He calls us to sit in it. And it's difficult. I'm telling you what, I'm probably the worst one in the room about this. I skip over the difficult as much as I can. In fact, if I can't skip over the difficult, I go back to start and see how I can try to skip over the difficult. That's my approach. My wife can verify that for us. But that's what we're doing here in the book of Job. We're taking time to sit in the difficult. But the best thing we can do is to increase our intimacy with God, to join in that, to move closer to Him. And only then will we find what we're looking for.